Wonderful. Thanks for joining me today, Dr. Rolston.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be here in Boston to meet with you and speak about your career in neurosurgery and all that. It's interesting. The way I found out about your portfolio and your work and stuff was I actually was looking to speak to someone who was doing like computer brain interface things, and I wasn't necessarily looking for a neurosurgeon specifically, maybe someone in biomedical engineering, which you're involved in as well. And I got in contact with Dr. Steve Potter, who's like since relocated to Europe, and that didn't pan out. But he recommended you. And what I think is interesting is that specifically in his email back to me, he said, "Oh, you should check out Dr. Rolston at Harvard. He'd be a great role model for your audience." So I thought I'd pay you that compliment. That's why I'm here to interview you, because I think you'd be fantastic for my viewers to learn from.
Yeah,
so
I appreciate it. Yes, Steve Potter was my PhD advisor back in Atlanta when I was at Emory and Georgia Tech, and brilliant man, really passionate about understanding how the brain works, and someone that I really gravitated toward when I was there, and really had a great time.
Very cool. So I was doing some research on your background, and you've had the kind of plethora in terms of just fulfilling all the academic milestones and all of that. Of course, you're a neurosurgeon now, but there's a lot of steps that precede that. And so when you were like my age in your early 20s, you were studying computer science actually in undergrad. And then I'm curious as to, because most people, a career in computer science is very lucrative. It's a good career, especially given where technology and society is going. You can make a lot of money, have a great life. How did you then end up in medicine, and then thinking about how can I apply computers to the brain? Like, what was going through your mind at that time?
Yeah, so ever since I was young, like high school or before, I really cared deeply about how the brain worked. I don't know why that started exactly, but I was always just fascinated with how all of our thoughts and feelings and hopes and dreams were all stored in this organ inside between our ears. And trying to figure out how that works has been a longstanding goal of mine. So interested in that, I learned more about computers and artificial intelligence. And so I thought that might be a really innovative way to study the brain and how it functions by understanding the computations of the brain. So I went to do my bachelor's in computer science, and really was excited about machine learning and artificial intelligence. But it turned out that at that time, in the 1999 to 2000, early 2000s, artificial intelligence was very artificial and not very intelligent.
What does that mean?
So there was the kind of algorithms they had at the time were like pretty simple ones, like principal component analysis, support vector machines, clustering. So stuff that's still really important, but not the kind of deep insights to new ways to learn how vision works or anything like that. There were people talking about such things and doing computations based on more neurally inspired ideas like neural networks. But in the computer science department at that time, there were no classes and no one talked about neural networks or deep learning. That was just not a thing we learned about. And I actually had to go to the psychology department to take a course in neural networks. And so I kind of... it's interesting, in 5 more years or 10 more years, and then that's when the deep learning revolution happens.
Yeah.
And now everyone cares about them again, and we've shown that they're really important. And that sort of inspiration from the brain has been really critical. But at the time, it wasn't there. So I was really, I went into computer science as purely a kind of scientific passion for understanding the deep fundamentals of how computation works in the world around us. So that was the computer science part.
Yeah.
Doing that, I was also still interested in the brain. So I did some research at the NIH during my summers there when I was in undergrad. And one of the people I worked with was a doctor, a neurologist, Adrian Danek from Germany, who was spending some time at the NIH to learn functional magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI studies.
Okay.
So I was with this guy. He was the first person I met, that I knowingly met, who was an MD PhD. So he was a PhD, and so was doing science, but also an MD and seeing patients.
Right.
And there was one particular patient that he brought in with neuroacanthocytosis, which is a really rare, devastating disease.
What does that involve? I'm not sure what that is.
So it has it's a disease that's genetically inherited that can cause neurodegeneration. So
okay.
Kind of like on the same grand spectrum of things like Huntington's disease.
Oh, got it.
but much more rare. And so,
Sure.
so seeing him interact with this patient and seeing this that kind of personal rapport that he was able to develop with someone who had a really serious disease, and to spend a good portion of his life trying to further the treatment for this disease was really inspiring. And that was the first time I really understood that you could be a researcher and do things in the basic sciences, but also be a clinician and take what you're learning at the bench and immediately apply it to patients at the bedside. And also that kind of warmth and having patient interactions was something I really liked and wanted to do more of.
Yeah, I think speaking to someone like yourself, you're in such a unique position because you're not just doing the grunt work, in clinic and seeing patients and applying the techniques that, science has produced, but you're also producing these techniques and researching these things. And I think that makes your perspective really interesting. I was in New York last week, and I was speaking to Dr. David Langer there. He's a neurosurgeon. He does a tumor-based neurosurgery. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He had a Netflix special. Yeah, I was speaking with him, and his view on neurosurgery is interesting because he thinks that the personalities it attracts are very pathologic and very psychopathic, and just these people who are very type A, ambitious, and I'm sure you're all of those things in the positive sense of the word. But I don't get this sense that you're malicious or trying to step on people's toes. And
No.
I think people have this idea that neurosurgeons, for lack of a better term, have this God complex or are very in that way. Would you say that that's been your experience in neurosurgery, working with other neurosurgeons?
So I haven't really had that experience. So when I think when I started getting the idea in my head to become a neurosurgeon, I was in medical school and I didn't know much about the field. But one of my two PhD co-advisors was Bob Gross, who's a neurosurgeon at Emory, and really great, down-to-earth guy, really interested in the same sort of philosophical questions about neuroscience that I am, and also the practical aspects of how we can use what we're doing in the lab to help people. So he was a great example. And when I started doing in the process of preparing to apply for neurosurgery residency, you do rotations at your home institution and at other places. And I did my away rotation at UCSF in California, San Francisco. And meeting all the neurosurgeons there, not only the residents, but all the faculty, they were all, very inspirational people, very smart, had interests and hobbies outside of neurosurgery, and there really weren't, people that were malignant or really, difficult personalities to work with. Everyone has, certain ego things that come into play, but at least there where I did my training, they usually came from a good place. And so if someone was, really worried about something or really upset about something, it was because it involved a patient that they wanted to care better for.
Right.
And they held themselves to really high standards, and they held you to high standards too. And that's part of what I think makes you a better doctor is holding yourself to high standards and holding people that work with you to high standards. And that ultimately serves the patient best. So I think that the personalities I've seen have all been way more interesting and fun to be around and enjoyable people than some of those perceptions that you might have until you get into the field.
No, that's very good to hear, and I think most patients would benefit from a personality like that. People who are more interested in, maybe not more interested, but just as interested in the human components of medicine than maybe some of the clinical bureaucratic sides of medicine.
Yeah, and I think you see that with some of the recent books that have come out by neurosurgeons. So things like when breath becomes air.
Right, love that book.
Yeah, it's amazing, and that Paul when he wrote that, you can tell just what a great soul he was.
Yeah,
and this is the kind of person that goes to a place like Stanford or UCSF. And there's more that have come out since then, other books, and so I think that it kind of shows the type of people that neurosurgery is attracting.
Right. That's mind you, I'm not in neurosurgery. I'm applying to medical school, and I hope to one day, be in a similar position to where you are. But in my communications with various physicians and in organizing this podcast, I've been in contact with people who are doing lots of interesting things, and multiple neurosurgeons actually. I mentioned I spoke to Dr. David Langer. I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Henry Marsh out in England. Anyways, but to your point, I've noticed this deeper appreciation for life and this sort of philosophical side to almost nearly every neurosurgeon that I speak to. And it seems to be more than just sort of stacking accolades and wanting to seem important. There's this deep yearning for understanding the brain and maybe consciousness and life as a whole. So you mentioned that when you were sort of deciding to go into neurosurgery in medical school and you saw all these people with um, similar interests and philosophies about neuroscience to you, like what were some of those questions that you were so like keen on answering by going into neurosurgery?
Yeah, so for me, it was probably two parts to it. So one was, as a scientist, I want to keep doing science, and my interests are how the brain works. And to do that, I was kind of presented when I finished my PhD and was doing the last couple of years of medical school, all the different medical subspecialties you could do that would still involve the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So that was neurology. That's what I thought I was going to go into, is to become a neurologist, like Adrian was at the NIH, and so I was focused on that and knew a lot of neurologists and spent time with them. But other brain-involving disciplines are things like anesthesiology or neuroradiology, psychiatry, which I ended up really liking when I did my time there. But you have this kind of menu of things that involve the brain in my case, and I went through each of them and tried to see was it interesting scientifically and academically, but also did I get along with the people in it, and was it a good, could I imagine doing this day in, day out for the rest of my life? And the only one that I really felt that way about was neurosurgery. So it became a really easy choice. I just didn't I didn't enjoy the clinical day-to-day work of neurology or radiology or
Right.
anesthesiology as much as I loved neurosurgery, and it was just for me it was that or nothing. So that's why it gave it to me. So I think I could have, but as everyone has different personalities and different fits, and they enjoy different aspects of what challenges them at work, and so as long as you can focus on the organ you care about, you can do it from any of these angles, and we need people to do it from all these angles to be successful. And so we can't function without radiology, we can't function without anesthesiology. But for me, my particular sweet spot and angle was through neurosurgery.
Very cool. As I was doing more homework on you, the area of neurosurgery that you specialize in is quite interesting, and I think doesn't get a lot of public attention, or maybe because it's relatively new. So, just speaking as a layman, when I think of neurosurgery, I think of you open up the brain, you're taking out tumors, you're making incisions, very intense, high stress. I'm sure all of those things are true, but you do something called functional neurosurgery. So the first time I was ever exposed to functional neurosurgery was in undergrad. I went to a neuroscience conference and I saw Dr. Andre Lozano. He gave a keynote speech at that conference, and he was showing a video of him in the OR, essentially able to turn off and on like essential tremor in a patient. And it just looked like something out of sci-fi to me. I could not believe that this was happening. Like I'm from Toronto. This was happening in hospitals that I'm close to.
Mm-hmm.
So could you mind describing what functional neurosurgery is?
Sure. Yeah. So Lozano's world famous and super impressive, and so he's an epitome of a great surgeon scholar person. So that's great that you got to see that and got interested in it because of him. So neurosurgery is surgery of the nervous system, and that means brain, spine, peripheral nerves. And there's many different subparts of it. So there's people that focus on the vasculature of the brain, so things like aneurysms. There's people that focus on just spine surgery. Functional neurosurgery is mostly dealing with surgery that can change the function of the brain. So an aneurysm is near the brain, but it's not really it's not causing, unless it's causing like headache or other neurological symptoms, it's not really changing how the brain works. It's just making it work less well. Same thing with a tumor. But there are diseases that are actual diseases of how the brain functions day to day. So things like epilepsy or Parkinson's or essential tremor. So the brain might even look normal when you look at it on MRI, like someone with Parkinson's or essential tremor, but there's something going wrong there with how it's operating. And so our job, and we've, functional neurosurgery has been around for decades and decades, is to find ways to restore that function that wasn't quite working as well. So for epilepsy, that means stopping seizures from happening. For essential tremor, that means quieting the tremor. For Parkinson's, that means stopping the tremor and also helping with the stiffness and the slowness that these patients experience. All those things kind of fall in that purview. And that can either be electrical stimulation, which we do a lot of, so modulating the brain. It can be making precise little lesions in the brain, like we do focused ultrasound to get rid of a small pea-sized area that's causing problems. Or it can be larger removals of parts of the brain for things like epilepsy, like a temporal lobectomy to try to stop the seizures. Pain is another big part of functional neurosurgery, where people that have chronic pain or pain like trigeminal neuralgia, which is really severe pain in the face, also we can do surgeries to offer them relief of their pain too. So that's the kind of the spectrum of diseases we see in functional neurosurgery. And hopefully that'll expand in the future as we figure out ways to treat Alzheimer's or depression, which there are clinical trials ongoing for now.
Right.
So ways to really address more of the spectrum of neurological and psychiatric disorders.
Yeah, very cool. So among that array, so even within functional neurosurgery, there's a lot of applications to what you can do there. What does your research concentrate in?
So most of my research is in epilepsy surgery, and so I do a lot of epilepsy surgery in my practice, as well as surgery for Parkinson's, tremor. But the epilepsy surgery, that goes back to what my PhD was on, and my research is focused on kind of two aspects of epilepsy. One is just trying to figure out more about how epilepsy happens, and what I mean by that is, epilepsy, which is characterized by multiple recurrent seizures. We don't really have a good idea, even though we've known about epilepsy for millennia now, why a seizure wants to start at this day at 3 p.m. and not yesterday at 2:45 p.m. So that kind of a question of, why now? And why did it last 60 seconds and not 2 minutes? We really don't have good answers to those really fundamental questions about what epilepsy is and why it's happening. So trying to really understand the basic mechanisms of what's going on there is one of the motivating things in my lab. The other part of it is to look at epilepsy surgery, so what we're doing as surgeons, and ways to make that better. So by better, I mean safer, so less chance of causing a complication from surgery, and more effective. Epilepsy surgery is great. For someone that has epilepsy that's not being helped by medications, which is about 1 of every 3 patients, epilepsy surgery could be the only way to cure them. But it's not perfect. There are a lot of people that have surgery and are no better off.
Yeah.
And that's a terrible feeling for the patient, terrible for us as surgeons, and we want to do everything we can to make that so effective that it's almost a guarantee to get a good outcome.
What's the current outcome, like success rate? I don't know what the metric is.
Yeah, so when you compare, so if a person is drug resistant for epilepsy, and that means that they tried 2 medications for seizures and are still having seizures.
Yeah.
The chance of a 3rd or 4th or 5th medication helping is almost nothing. If they have temporal lobe epilepsy, so epilepsy starting in the hippocampus or amygdala or somewhere in the medial temporal lobe, kind of inside temporal lobe, if we do a temporal lobectomy for them, the chance of them being free of seizures is about 60 or 70%.
Oh, wow.
So that's great compared to almost nothing with medications.
Yeah.
But 60 or 70 means that if I do 10 of these cases, then 3 or 4 people are still having seizures. And so that's too many.
Yeah.
And so we want to get that down to 0, or 99 or out of 100 are seizure free. So we still have a long way to go. And the ways what we're trying to do that in our lab is find better ways to pinpoint exactly where the seizures are arising from, or what network in the brain that these seizures are involved with, so we can be really strategic with exactly what we knock out with the surgery to try to stop these things from happening.
In patients that experience epilepsy, so you mentioned trying to understand why it happens at a certain time. So is this, in those patients, do seizures happen in a predictable fashion?
They can, and they in some ways they can. So there are some people that have seizures that only happen at night, for instance. There are some people that have reflex seizures that happen when they have certain sensory or other kind of provocations. So some people can get triggered trigger seizures when they read, or trigger seizures when they see bright flashing lights. In those cases, it can be predictable. For the vast majority of people, they don't really know when it's going to happen, and that's what makes it or one of the major stressors for someone with epilepsy is that they don't know from one day to the next whether they're going to be stricken by a seizure that day or go the next 3 weeks without any seizures. It makes it hard to go to school. It makes it hard to work. It makes it hard to drive because it's very unpredictable.
Right.
And so a lot of people are working right now on ways to make it more predictable, to try to do what's called seizure forecasting, so that you might be able to say if they have certain algorithms that are applied to your body, your brain, they say that your chance of a seizure today is higher than normal. Beware. Or your chance of a seizure is very low today, so you can kind of take things on a more easy cadence.
When you say apply algorithms to your body, I think I know what you mean by that, but do you mind explaining more?
Yeah, sure. So there's we're lucky to live in a time where we have a lot of ways to gather quantified information about how our bodies are working. So whether that's an Apple Watch or a Fitbit for things like how much movement you're doing or sleep. There's other ways to get data from the brain itself. So there are certain devices that we implant for treating epilepsy that also monitor seizures. So one of them is this device. It's a responsive neurostimulator that has a computer in it that's listening to the brain all the time and can detect sort of abnormal activity. And so you can use that data, which is data from the brain itself, electrophysiological data from the brain. You can use actigraphic measures like sleep scoring or sleep from a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or an Oura Ring. You can do things like just normal activity, body temperature. You can get all these different data streams together and then try to use those with things like machine learning or deep learning to try to predict if a patient is more likely or less likely to have a seizure at any one time. Or we're not anywhere near the stage where we can say that, okay, this person's going to have a seizure like at 5 p.m. today.
Right.
But we're at least getting better about saying that, okay, there's higher than not likelihood or less likelihood from one time to the next. So that's it's nice, and people are using this kind of these data streams for a lot of different diseases. So things like Parkinson's, you can gather a lot of data about their gait. You can do studies like this, and there's people here at the Brigham that are working on this to see how people recover after brain surgery, by how much they're walking, by how social they are, using information from their cell phones, with their when they download, they're taking part in the studies, they know this.
Yeah.
But it's a way to just use more of the data that we're collecting from people to help improve their outcomes for any kind of surgery, any kind of disease.
That's amazing. It's amazing to see the application of computer science to neuroscience to actually better patients' experience, like the predictive power that you can get from applying those algorithms through. So this is you're implementing what into the brain to track these things.
Yeah. So there's very common device is responsive neurostimulator, which is a computer that's hermetically sealed with its own power.
How big
supply.
is this? Like just
it's about the size of like a Zippo lighter. So it's maybe this size.
Okay.
And that's it's pretty thin, a few millimeters, and so it actually sits underneath the skin of the scalp.
Under the skull?
Yeah, so they actually replace a bit of the bone with this device, so it ends up being like a little. They kind of substitute one after the other, so it's nice and smooth. So there's not a big bump.
Oh, so I wouldn't be able to tell if someone had one.
You wouldn't be able to tell. There might be a scar, but then the hair would cover the scar, but it would be smooth, and there'd be nothing that you could really tell.
Okay.
And that's connected to a couple of electrodes that go either into the brain or lay on top of the brain. And those electrodes each have a few electrical contacts, and that's what's getting the electrical activity from the brain. So these wires are transmitting that signal to this device, which is then interpreting it and then taking action, which it does with electrical stimulation. So that's one of these devices, and we can communicate with this through telemetry. So we have a little device that the person puts up next to their head every day, which downloads the data from this little tiny hard drive on the device and puts it onto a laptop or something that has, in a sense, like almost infinite storage at that point.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm going to backtrack a little bit with you. So you mentioned that you've known, like, as a science, we've known about epilepsy for a long time, but we haven't really been able to explain it, which I think is interesting because I think science has a lot of these gaps. And I'll give you an example. So later today, I'm actually going to go to MIT to speak to Dr. Emory Brown. I think he's cross-appointed here as well. So he works in anesthesia.
He's a brilliant guy. So I actually met him at Woods Hole, Massachusetts, in a course on this kind of data analysis applied to neuroscience. And he is such a great, super smart person. And the only reason I ever considered anesthesiology was because of him, and just
really?
what a fantastic, perfect example of a clinical scholar that you could be and do all this cool math at the same time.
Right.
So I think he's just if I could be half as good at anything as he is, I would die happy. He's wonderful. So you're lucky to.
I'm excited to speak with him, but I think you two are similar in your career trajectories in that you use the rigorous science and computation and apply it to the clinical stuff. So I think that's really cool. But to liken it back to what you study to epilepsy, so from what I understand, the way he explains anesthesia is that it's a practice that we've been using for 100 years, but we effectively don't know how or why it works, but just that it works. And he explains how propofol, we can understand what dosage to give and all that, but we don't understand what it's doing to the underlying neurobiology. And that's kind of where he concentrates. And he has a theory about why it works, and he talks about oscillating, oscillations that occur between different parts of the brain, which create this anesthesia state, right? That's a very bad way of explaining everything he does, but what's the leading hypothesis or understanding about epilepsy? Because I understand there's not a conclusive kind of catch-all understanding, but what are we going with as a science right now?
So there's a lot of competing theories about what's giving rise to seizures, and so as an electrophysiologist, so someone who thinks more in terms of voltages and numbers, we tend to think about abnormal synchrony in the brain, so that there's something is getting all these neurons, that the brain cells, to start firing in time together, in lockstep, rather than firing all in their own patterns. And when neurons are more independent, when they're doing things that are kind of different from one another, that's when you have consciousness, and that's when you have thinking, because you have this amazing way to store all sorts of different information and unique information. If everything's doing the same thing all at the same time, that's really low informational state. So that's when you lose consciousness or when you have a seizure. So there's actually a lot of overlap, I think, with anesthesia and seizures. And we see that when you have a seizure, many seizures, you lose consciousness. And it's not, understanding that is still unclear, why people lose consciousness in some seizures versus others. But what you see in a seizure where someone loses consciousness is that a lot of the brain tends to be doing the same thing at the same time, these big waves. And they can be at different frequencies, but when you look at an EEG, you see big synchronous oscillations of neural activity across the brain. And you see the similar stuff in anesthesia. It's different frequencies, but again, you see a lot of the brain doing the same things at the same time and not a lot of independent things. So that's one hypothesis. What sets it up for that synchrony? We're not sure whether it's wired in such a way that makes it more likely, or whether the activity patterns themselves are more likely to do that. Whether it's pharmacological or driven by different changes in neurotransmitters or cell types.
Right.
And there's everyone that has these different beliefs about this proposes different treatments based upon these. So for people that believe it's synchrony of neural activity, they try to do something electrical to stop that, like the NeuroPace device or deep brain stimulation or transcranial magnetic stimulation for epilepsy. For people that lean more toward the cell-based hypothesis, they try to transplant cells. And all of these are doing great things. There was a really famous example at UCSF recently where they had a sea lion who had epilepsy. Sea lions tend to get epilepsy because they eat urchins that have some sort of toxin in them. I think it's domoic acid. I can look that up later. But they develop epilepsy that's very similar to human epilepsy. Mm-hmm. And Scott Baraband there at UCSF transplanted some cells and was able to essentially cure this sea lion's epilepsy. And the animal's name is Cronut, which is a cool name.
Yeah, that is a cool name.
But it shows you that there's room for all these different approaches, and we still don't quite know what's going on, but we're finding things that work anyway based upon our best understanding at the time. And that's how a lot of science works, is that you have a good theory, you try to make as much progress with that as you can until you find that it starts crumbling or it has some sort of weakness,
Right.
and then you replace that with a new theory.
So there's sort of mechanical manipulation with electrodes and things like that you can use to tackle it. And then are we doing that sort of cellular manipulation in humans as of yet, or is it just an animal model?
Yeah, so gene therapy and cell therapy, and so gene therapy is when you try to place a new gene in the existing cells, and cell therapy is where you try to place new cells, like stem cells, that can take on the identity of cells that are missing or not working correctly.
Right.
So there are trials for these things going on for epilepsy, but very small scale right now. So there's no giant trials of hundreds or thousands of patients yet. So it's all very very
Right.
cutting edge and experimental right now. But there's precedent in animal models, and there have been some reports of these therapies working, at least at a promising level in humans, enough that people are still investing in it. Parkinson's is another area where gene therapy and cell therapy have been going on for a lot longer.
Right.
None of those trials that have been going on for decades now have really been generated anything that's the standard of care yet. But with every trial, they get a little closer.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's still a hope that in the next 10 or 20 years, we'll have really good treatments for diseases like this, especially for diseases that are caused by known genetic mutations like Huntington's. Like we know exactly what trinucleotide repeat that is, or AADC deficiency, which happens more in pediatrics. If we can target those, we might within a really shorter time actually have good treatments that can cure these things. It'll be amazing.
Wow.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like a more efficacious solution than sort of these mechanical manipulations. But the time horizon is of course long. But I think the fruit that will come from that will be really good for patients. So you treat patients who are experiencing drug-resistant epilepsy.
Mm-hmm.
So prior to meeting you, what are the things that patients go through to sort of deal with their epilepsy?
Yeah, great question. So when a person has their first few seizures, they kind of at some point they realize they have epilepsy. Some doctor figures it out. That could be a community, their primary care doctor, neurologist, or someone else that's been treating them.
Yeah.
And they usually start with an anti-seizure medication, of which there are many. For a lot of people, that's enough. And so they try their first anti-seizure medication, and they're essentially cured. They're not having seizures anymore, which is just wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, the first one doesn't work, or they have too many side effects. They try a different one, and then maybe another portion is helped with that one. Then there's that group that is not helped by any medication. They just try different medications until they are referred to an epilepsy center that sort of thinks about things more in the surgical sense, like ours here. And then they start to do a workup to see if this person has seizures that could be treated with surgery. And so what we do then is we're trying to figure out what's causing the seizures, and is it in a location that we can do something about.
Right.
So there's simple things like MRIs to look for brain tumors or vascular malformations that are things that are pretty easy to treat surgically, or things like scarring that can give away where a seizure might be starting from. Then there's other imaging things we can do, like PET scans or SPECT scans, which are a little more advanced, that can give you more insight to what's going on. Everyone gets a long-term EEG monitoring where we put electrodes on their head and then watch them to see when they have a seizure, and then figure out where in their head that seizure starts.
Is this that cap that has all?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a few different ones. You can either have a cap, like a mesh cap, or you can actually put them on one by one with some glue.
Oh, okay.
And that's probably more common. And then you watch the seizure evolve. The problem with those is that they to see a seizure, because they're rare and unpredictable, it takes a long time. So if you just did it for a few hours, you probably aren't going to see anything. So you have to usually do it for days. So you have this person in the hospital waiting to have seizures, and then you have one or two, and they say, okay, we saw 2 seizures, both from the left side. This person has left temporal lobe epilepsy.
Okay.
So we have the electrophysiological part, which is the EEG. We have the imaging part, which is MRIs, PET scans, SPECT scans. And then there's some other things you can do, like a MEG study, which is magnetoencephalography. So it uses, instead of using electrical signals, magnetic signals, which are generated by the brain to pinpoint stuff. And all of these give you some hypothesis about where things are happening and what the culprit is. If that's enough, then you can go right to do a surgery to treat it. Like if you see mesial temporal sclerosis or scarring of the hippocampus, and you know that the seizures are starting from the same spot, taking that scarred part out is a great way to help the patient.
Right.
Sometimes you can't, and then you have to do more invasive monitoring. So we often will put electrodes into the brain deeper to capture better pictures, a higher resolution picture of what's going on in the brain's activity that's causing seizures.
Okay.
And then once we do that, then we might have finally the real answer to where things are starting from and know what the next step is, whether that's brain stimulator or removing that part of the brain or using a laser to burn out part of the brain. Whatever we can do to stop those seizures and help this person get back to a life that is less affected by these unpredictable seizures.
So surgically, you can go in and just remove the parts of the brain that are not like behaving as they should, or you can go in and do some type of stimulation and get them to behave better. So you mentioned that for a lot of patients that drugs is enough, and it'll help control their epilepsy. So what are those drugs going in and doing? How are they altering the brain such that it's able to control epilepsy in them and then not in others?
That's another really good question that we don't totally know for sure all the mechanisms by which these drugs work. So a lot of them
that sounds reassuring.
Yeah. But so a lot of them do things like either turn down how excitable cells can be, so it makes them less likely to fire. Some of them increase inhibition, again, making cells less likely to fire. And they can do that by affecting sodium channels or different receptors like GABA receptors. And so they work by a myriad of different mechanisms, and some of them kind of work by multiple ones at the same time. And which one of those is the most important one, we're not quite sure. And so it's something along with that pharmacology is what's helping these patients. There's a lot of work that goes into testing all of these, and they test them in a lot of animal models before they go to humans. And a lot of the medications, even though they've had a lot of advances in medications since the 1980s, the effectiveness of them hasn't really changed much. They're still about as effective as they were back in the 1980s. They might have better side effects, but it's really rare to come up with a new medication that works better than the other ones. And there's one more recently that's maybe a little better that people are very excited about, but we're still it's not like we're coming up with blockbuster drugs all the time.
Right.
Yeah. If we were, that'd be great. So if you can ever, and I tell
put you out of a job.
Yeah, that's fine. So if I were a patient and I could cure my epilepsy with a pill, I would do it.
Yeah.
And the same thing with we say this to patients with tremor too. If they have some patients will come to see us for tremor surgery before they've tried any medications. And we say that you need to try a medication first, because if you can stop your tremor with the medication, then you're done. Whereas if you have to do brain surgery, that's surgery. It has potential complications.
Right.
And so it's always better to try the least invasive thing first before you go on to the more invasive stuff.
I think your vantage point on all of this stuff is really unique, because you see things that the majority of people would never need to encounter, or to just would never think that it exists. Like when I first started learning about like DBS and all of these techniques, I was surprised that these things were happening. But I think that is getting public attention now, and I'll explain why I'm pivoting this direction. So Elon Musk, Tesla, he's pivoting, and he started this company Neuralink, and I think you as a neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, would have an interesting vantage point into this, because the public sentiment about this is, oh, this is crazy. I would never put something in my brain to enhance it. We're all going to turn into robots. But then there seems to be really good clinical applications to this. I don't know if you saw his animal models that he's used to. He had a monkey like playing video games, and they're able to predict the monkey's behavior based on the neural firing in its brain, and he had a pig model and these things. So in terms of the commercial aspect of all of these technologies, where are we going as a society?
That's a really good question, and it's been a question that people have been asking for a long time now, for probably decades. So, people have done things with non-human primates where they've looked at brain activity and used it to control devices. Miguel Nicolelis at Duke has been a good person working on this. Andy Schwartz at University of Pittsburgh. And they've also had devices in humans with diseases like ALS or bad damage to the brain or spinal cord where they couldn't control their limbs anymore.
Yeah.
And they've used implants to control robotic arms, to feed themselves. There's great videos online you can see for things like this. So that kind of technology has been around for a while. Neuralink is doing similar stuff, but generating a lot of publicity, which is great. So the more attention that we focus on this as a society, from my standpoint, is great because I think it's really exciting, and we want to devote more resources to these investigations.
Right.
What the way that I would like to see these devices used, and the way that I use them in my patients, is to help with diseases. So to treat epilepsy, to treat Parkinson's disease, to treat pain, that's when I think of using a device that changes how the brain is processing information to make it, to try to help patients minimize the symptoms of whatever disease they have.
Right.
I have never and have no plans or interest in doing anything that's beyond that for like cosmetic neurosurgery.
Right, that's an interesting term.
But I'm sure people will, and so that's like when Kelly Foot and Mike Oken have this good thoughts behind cosmetic surgery. So when people started doing things like surgery for burn people that have had tragic burns or trauma, they developed all these procedures to for cosmetic surgery to improve their outcomes after those injuries. And then people started doing the same techniques for just for totally elective, like non-clinical reasons for cosmetic surgery.
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible that something similar, and this is what Kelly and Mike were saying, is that something similar could happen with neurosurgery if there are devices that could enhance something about the way the brain works. People would probably start doing that, and it's a real ethical problem to think about how that works. It's probably going to be unfairly available to people that are really wealthy, or people that can afford to go to some island somewhere and do it. And that's not the kind of society we want where that occurs. So we have to. That now is the time to start thinking about the ethics of this and putting safeguards on it. And they've done that same thing with things like CRISPR, where they've talked about using this technique, which is being used for genetic engineering in animals, and then eventually for humans with diseases. Try to not let it be used for elective reasons or things that aren't justified clinically. But it's already being done. So people, there's people that started doing like cosmetic genetic engineering in China. There was a big story about that. And so we want to develop these guardrails and safeguards. And like you pointed out, now is the time, especially now that you have more flashy companies jumping in that are generating interest in this. Now's the time to establish these safeguards and the ethical principles behind this.
Right. I think your point is very true. That would create a lot of disparities that I don't even think we could foresee right now.
Yeah.
Just thinking about, like, we more or less live in a meritocracy, right? And if you were to just have people who are super cognitively enhanced, then what does that say about the playing field? It creates a lot of ethical questions. I'm curious, so you gave the example of CRISPR and gene editing, and I think that's an example that the public at large is become familiar with. That idea it's not so novel anymore that these things are happening. I think people have a sense that those things are happening as well. Are similar things happening in the sort of neurological device space that maybe we don't hear about?
Right now there's no like cognitive enhancing neural implant that.
So if I had $1 million, I couldn't go somewhere.
You couldn't go anywhere. There are people that have tried to do things like that. So there is a movement that's somewhat interesting for people that have tried to do kind of biohacking of themselves with electrical devices. And so there's if you look online, you can find people that do what's like through the skin. They'll have devices that can either do direct current stimulation or alternating current stimulation. You can find blueprints the idea is that you put these devices on your head and you can change your focus or concentration. The evidence is pretty spotty with that, but people are hacking these devices together. It's dangerous. It's not great, but people are trying that. But whatever, it's not like there's the power of those treatments is pretty definitely unproven, not very strong. So that there's not like a this hidden ability to do all these things. If we knew how to do those kind of changes, we would start using them clinically for people that needed it, but they just don't exist right now.
Sure. I think let me flip it a little bit. I think the sentiment behind that movement might be a little bit lazy, in the sense that even like when you look at cosmetic surgery, right? You could work out for a really good body, or you can go and pay for one, right? So you as a neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, what are some good habits or things that we can do to improve our brains without surgery?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so that's an excellent point. So the best things are things we've known about for centuries now, which is diet and exercise. And so even the Stoics will talk about this. But if you improving your brain function, you can see actual changes if you have a good exercise routine and a healthier diet. There's a really good book recently by Sanjay Gupta, who's also a neurosurgeon.
Right. I tried to get him on. He's a bit busy.
He's been busy. So it's about brain health and things you can do to stave off dementia, but it also applies to this normal cognition too. So diet and exercise are the two most powerful proven things with basically no side effects. So it's the best of all possible worlds. And also not only helpful for your brain, but helpful for your heart and the rest of your body too. So diet and exercise, and then being social seems to have a protective effect. So the people, the more social interactions you have, or the more involved you are with your community, that tends to improve, all sort of cognitive metrics we look at. Really? So that's good. So doing stuff like you're doing, like a podcast where you meet a lot of interesting people is great. And then doing activities that challenge you seems to also be helpful. So whether that's a job that's challenging, that's fulfilling, or whether that's a new hobby that you're picking up, all those things tend to not only get you engaged more socially, but also get your mind more engaged with things around you too. So those are the things that we know are essentially side effect free and helpful. Other stuff like supplements like B12 and things like that don't seem to work for anybody. Unless you have a true vitamin deficiency, which almost no one in this country does with the modern diets we have. Then it can help you, but if you're supplementing on top of that, it is not going to help and probably has problems.
That's interesting. I think before we get to the supplements, I think all of those things that you mentioned are things that everyone can do in their context, in their life. They don't cost any money. They require some effort though. So I think there's some intentionality required on all of our parts, but this all sounds very doable. I find the supplement thing interesting. Is there any reason that a normal person should be taking supplements to enhance their brain? I've seen a lot of companies pop up that are producing these supplements that supposedly have all these cognitive benefits and whatever, and they're doing well. They're selling, and they have people who claim that they work. Is that necessary to perform?
Yeah, there's no good evidence that any of those things that help at all. So unfortunately, if they did, great, it'd be wonderful to use. Right now, there's just not any compelling evidence. And unfortunately, most of the nutrition literature that we have, or the nutrition studies we've done, they've done a great job of identifying the importance of certain vitamins and minerals. But then the tendency is to say, okay, well, this is a good thing, like vitamin E is good. Let's just see if we max out vitamin E in a person, like that will help all these, or vitamin D is another good one. It turns out that when they do bigger trials, there's either no effect or a negative effect when you try to go above what the body is exposed to. So things like bone fractures with calcium and vitamin D levels, supplemental beyond what you normally need is not that helpful, not beneficial. And certain multivitamins increase risk of things like cancer. So there's it's that the whole idea of trying to outsmart the body by force feeding a thing is not totally developed yet. And that proves that there's this whole area of nutrition which is just hasn't been studied nearly enough as it should be, and there's just so much room for like cutting edge research that can change billions of lives. So that'd be a great area to go into. And even in medical school, we learn almost nothing about nutrition.
Right, I've heard this that the nutrition education in med school is abysmal.
as well as like physical activity too. So the two things that are probably the most protective for cardiovascular disease and brain diseases, we learn nothing about. We learn instead about like classic vitamin diseases like beriberi or kwashiorkor. So it's like really stuff that we just don't see that much here, but we don't learn about the stuff that actually makes a huge difference.
That's fascinating. We're running out of time. I wish I could speak to you longer, but I appreciate you carving out some time in your day. I get to speak to a neurosurgeon at Harvard. I understand how difficult it must have been to sort of squeeze something like this in. So I'm going to leave you with this. My audience is primarily students. They want to do things in science. What makes a good scientist?
Yeah, so that's really open ended, and there's I think a lot of things. But what I think is the most important qualities I see in other people who I think are doing this well is having a clear, important question that person cares about. So a great example. So one of the surgeons that taught me a lot at UCSF, Eddie Chang, who's the chair there now, brilliant scientist, great surgeon, and his work is a lot pretty focused on language in the brain. So when you ask him what does your lab study or what do you care about, he's pretty simply can say I want to find out where a word is in the brain, and something like that where people don't understand, but he can make it so concise and compelling. And that sort of question, it impacts every human on the planet that's vocal, being interest and help have clinical implications for people that lose their ability to speak. So having something like that is incredibly motivating, and then just being able to focus on that and then find techniques that can help you do it. That's, I think, the mark of a good scientist. So having a really clear, important question that you can focus on. And then I see a tendency for a lot of people to get infatuated with different techniques, whether that's deep learning or some other statistical methods that they might find attractive, and then try to apply that to a lot of different diseases. I find that it can be incredibly useful for people that are laying new groundwork for things, but I think having the more question that has a biological for biologists, a biological significance tends to be pretty powerful. So don't get too caught up in making sure that you know every possible technique or get in love with a certain technique. Really just focus on what you care about as a problem and focus on that.
That's fantastic. Thank you for your time, Dr. Rolston.
No problem.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.